Well, hello, folks. Pastor Rocky Branch, Spruce Pine First Baptist Church. A very important word for you today about trying to do the right thing, wanting to do the right thing, hoping to do the right thing, but it may not be exactly the right thing. You know, we can be challenged by stuff to do. We can want to do certain things, and we may feel very compelled to do certain things. And this happens all the time in church, that people, they have a certain commitment where they want to do so much. And, you know, it's not necessarily, if you might look at it in the long picture, something that would be bad or wrong or unholy or anything like that. It might be good, but the timing may not be good. You know, Paul says in Romans 10 about the church of Israel, if you will, or the people of the Jewish people. He says, I bear record of you that you have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. So that means that there's a lot of people that get excited about stuff, but they don't have the foundational principles to make this thing work. And that's a challenging thing. So there's a debate here. It's been a debate for years. It's probably more of a debate with me than it would be of any other preacher that you would talk to. And the reason is because of what happened as a result of it. Now, knowing for sure that the Apostle Paul is going to be arrested and he's going to Rome. I know that. No trouble about that. I know that's going to happen. And that's what happened. The question is, why did it happen the way it happened? Now, let's do some homework here. Let's think about our own personal lives. There have been things in our lives that have happened to us that God used, certainly. That God, even though maybe the direction might have been wrong, God still used it and turned us back to where maybe we ought to be. And of course, we were hopefully willing to listen. Maybe got off track a little bit, got back on track. I mean, that happens to us quite often, especially if you take your relationship with Christ very seriously. Well, Paul obviously took his seriously. You remember I mentioned to you this, not to forget it, over in the 18th chapter of Acts, in verse number 18. It tells us there that Paul, after he stayed there a period of time, where in the region where he was, this when he met Priscilla and Aquila, you remember, that while he was there for a good while, he was leaving the brethren to sail from where he was to Syria, and then with Priscilla and Aquila, having shaved his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. You remember I asked you, don't forget that. Well, that's coming up. That's coming up where we are, at least the beginning of it. When Eutychus fell out of the window loft and Paul went down there and he raised up and whatever happened to him, they began to move their journey toward Miletus and Trophimus and Salamis and they started going. And then Paul wanted to go back through Ephesians or to Ephesus where the Ephesian people were, because he loved them so much. He put so much investment in them. And it's so important to understand that. But now here's a statement that you need to get. In chapter 20, it says, for Paul had determined, in verse number 16, to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia. Listen now. For he had hastened, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Well, now, if you don't know the end of the story, that has a lot to do with a shaved head. I mean, it has a lot to do with it, but, you know, not knowing the end of the story, maybe you don't know the end of the story, and that probably doesn't mean anything to you if you don't. But what I'm telling you is that I want you to remember that. Because he says, I've got to get to Jerusalem on the time of Pentecost. And we know what Pentecost is, of course, that's the celebration. Well, there's everybody in the country there. The whole world is coming to Jerusalem. I mean, listen, folks. I mean, we got a ton of people coming to Jerusalem. And Paul says, I've got to be there. Now, I'm going to show you handedly, without any question, how that this thing could have gone one or two ways. And often in our lives, we have the challenge of what life is about of one or two ways. It reminds me of the book of Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 51. And if you look at that passage and you go down through the end of the chapter to chapter 10, but in the first at least 5 verses, if you will mark, and then in chapter 10, verse 1, if you will mark, and perhaps verse 2, if I remember, if you would mark in that his face, his face, his face. And it's important because of Luke 9, because Jesus is sending his disciples to get the burro that he's going to ride into Jerusalem on. But the interesting part, and there's so much there. I mean, look, folks, this thing's deep as the ocean. There's so much stuff in that I just need to pull out one thing. The Bible says that the burro, the colt, where never a man sat, was tied at a place where two ways meet. And the Bible says, loose him and bring him to the Lord. Now, you and I are at a place, often in our lives, where two ways meet. We're just simply there. We're at a place where two ways meet. And the decision is, which way am I going to go? Well, I have 3 choices. I can stay tied and just be satisfied where I am. Or I can go my own way. Or I can be released and go to the master. And that's what happened. But there's such theological challenges in that 9th chapter starting in verse 51. And if you look at that, mark where it says his face. Jesus said his face. Jesus said his face. And then all the way to chapter 10, verse 22. Jesus said his face. Well, in Paul's account, Paul is going determined, no matter what, to go to Jerusalem. No matter what anybody says, he's going. That's why he shaved his head, of which is incredible. And I'll tell you more about that later. God bless you. Think about it. Goodbye.